Dr. Dugel, tell us a little bit about the scope of your work.
What I am is a retina specialist in Phoenix, Arizona, with an appointment also at USC in Los Angeles.
Right.
I practice in a private setting, but I also do a number of clinical trials and work with industry as well as teach.
Excellent. Tell us about some of the work that you're presenting here at AAO 2017.
Well, there are two talks that I did. Was the first one was in regards to a drug called Brolucizumab, which is a molecule that's a unique molecule that's being developed by Novartis.
Right.
And the trials are called the HAWK and HARRIER trials, and these are phase 3 registration trials.
Right.
That was the first talk. The second talk was in regards to drugs in the pipeline for diabetic macular edema.
Right. What do the data show so far?
For HAWK and HARRIER, that's a phase 3 registration trial.
Yes.
What was announced in the press release prior to my presentation was that in a majority of patients, 57% and 52%, in HAWK and HARRIER, patients were able to be extended for 12 weeks immediately after the loading phase. What I showed when I presented is the entirety of the trial. And it's important to understand that the trial itself was really composed of two different parts, if you will. There was a loading phase and there was a maintenance phase. Aflibercept, the comparator, was given on label. With Brolucizumab, there was a period of time from the time of enrollment to week 16 when there was a direct head-to-head comparison with Aflibercept. So I showed results of that direct head-to-head comparison, which was at week 16, which showed that from a structural point of view, Brolucizumab was statistically superior to Aflibercept. I also showed the data for the maintenance phase, where a majority of patients were extended to Q12 weeks. And even with the majority of patients being on Q12 weeks versus the Q8 weeks that was on label for Aflibercept, that structural superiority still remained at week 48.
Was there any interval change compared to other agents, or were you using the same regimen?
Well, the Aflibercept was given with the regimen that's on label, and as I mentioned for Brolucizumab, during the loading phase, it was matched entirely. It was directly compared and matched in the loading phase +1, so at week 16. Thereafter, at week 16, there was something called a disease activity assessment. And then there were pre-specified time points thereafter when disease activity was assessed. At any time, if there was found to be disease activity, the patient was adjusted to Q8 dosing. So there are several time points here that are very important. The first time point that's very important is at week 16, because there we have the opportunity to see a direct matched head-to-head comparison. The other time point that's very important is from that point, from week 16 till week 48, when the primary endpoint readout was, because there we have the ability to see what percentage of patients could be extended, and then we have the ability to see what happens to that phase when patients are extended. And what was shown is that non-inferiority was maintained, so vision was not lost despite a majority being extended. And again, despite a majority being extended, the superiority in the structure, as measured by OCT, was still maintained.
Were you able to assess the frequency of complications such as geographic atrophy versus other agents?
Well, again, it's important to understand the totality of the data. These two aren't the only studies. They're also they're registration studies, but there were studies that were done with this molecule before this phase 3 study. Obviously, there was a phase 1 study that was done. There was something called the Osprey study, which was a phase 2 study that was done. And in all the studies, not just in HAWK and HARRIER thus far, but in the phase 2 Osprey study as well as the phase 1 study, there's been no increased incidence of geographic atrophy. These are things that will be looked at very, very carefully but thus far there's been no signs whatsoever.
Okay. So if you look at the landscape of VEGF therapy, where would you place this particular agent?
Well, obviously for neovascular macular degeneration, as well as for diabetic macular edema, as well as for vein occlusion and pathologic myopia, and others, we've found that VEGF-A is an excellent target. And if we have a drug that allows us better disease control and greater durability, what it has the potential to do is to provide better efficacy as well as a better long-term strategy for our patients. So the potential is certainly there for this to be a dominant drug in the market as far as VEGF-A as a target is concerned. Now, I also look forward to other combination drugs coming up, but the exciting thing for our field is that we've made enormous amounts of progress, but we also have identified what our unmet needs are. And there are so many drugs in the pipeline that I think we're on the precipice of changing our treatment paradigm and being able to offer patients even better treatment outcomes.
Let's talk about that pipeline. What are the most promising agents and approaches in your view?
Well, as far as I think it's worthwhile to look upon this in several categories, right? There's a group of the next generation anti-VEGF-A drugs, and Brolucizumab that we've discussed so far is obviously the one that's furthest ahead in development. However, there's also Abisapar by Allergan, also known as DARPin. It's an alternate scaffold drug, also it's 36 kilodaltons, and that's currently in development, that's currently undergoing clinical trials. There's also another one that's quite interesting that's available in China from Kanghang Biotech, that's called Combercept, and it's being sold in China under the trade name of Lumitin. It's a trap molecule that's a fully humanized that binds to VEGF-A, B, and PIGF. So those are the next generation, and I think, again, Brolucizumab is the one that we know most about and is the furthest ahead in terms of development in this country, in the U.S. There are combination agents also that are quite promising. A interesting pathway that has received a lot of attention is the angiopoietin pathway. So here there are two drugs, something called RG7716 by Roche Genentech, which is a bispecific product. So it's a single molecule that has the ability to inhibit VEGF-A as well as Ang2 with the same molecule. The other approach is by Regeneron Bayer using a drug called Neovascular with Aflibercept. This is also an anti-Ang2 combination, Neovascular with Aflibercept, which we know well as a anti-VEGF-A, and that's a combination agent. So those trials are currently ongoing as well, with the data expected sometime next year. There are also other combination pathways that are interesting. For instance, Opthea has a drug called OPT-302, which is a VEGF-C and D inhibitor, and it's thought that by combining that with VEGF-A will achieve pan-VEGF inhibition. Tissue factor is another one that's very interesting, which is by a company called Iconic. Tissue factor inhibits the pathway in a very upstream, so that has great promise as well. And finally, I'd like to probably mention squalene, which is a topical agent because of its very unique mode of application, which is a broad-acting, broad-spectrum agent, and the results of that are expected in the next few months. There are many others as well, but those are just the ones that I'll mention to you.
What about complement pathway agents?
Complement pathway agents are mainly being tested in geographic atrophy and dry macular degeneration. There is a complement, anti-complement drug that's being tested currently in neovascular macular degeneration, and it's called Zimura by Opthotech, and this inhibits C5. But there are a number of complement inhibitors, some of which have shown some promise in the treatment of dry macular degeneration and geographic atrophy.
So as we look at this universe of new agents coming on and moving it through the pipeline, how do you see these agents positioning themselves in terms of therapeutic optimization in different patient categories?
So that's an extremely interesting question for several reasons. From a clinical trial point of view, clinical trials really shouldn't be cross-trial compared. So it's very unlikely that there will be comparative studies on all these drugs. I just don't think logistically that's possible. So physicians, people like myself, are going to have to make judgments based on the data, not just the data, but the level of data. Post hoc analyses obviously don't rise to the same level of data as prospective randomized clinical trials. So we're going to have to look at the data very carefully, which is what we're supposed to be doing anyway. After all, we're supposed to be clinical scientists, so that feels like the right thing to do. So that's from an academic sense. From a practical sense, pricing will matter a lot. Where these drugs are priced for what incremental benefit they will give us is also going to be very, very important, not only in the U.S. but around the world.
Yeah. And we've heard a lot about price control. Dr. Seema Verma from HHS gave a keynote address here at AAO and saying that this administration's concern is about pricing. How do you expect that to play out in terms of the industry's response to that?
Well, I think it's really too early to tell. When you have a drug that has an incremental benefit in a very, very important disease, it's very difficult to define the value of that incremental benefit. And it's difficult for individuals to define it, let alone for large companies and governments to agree to define it. So, I understand the concern. We all should be concerned, and we all should be vigilant, because these drugs, as good as they are, should be accessible to everybody. That's what we really want, not just in this country, but around the world. And around the world, it's even a bigger problem, as you well know. So I think it's really too early to tell, but it's certainly not too early to start having the conversation so that all of us are aware of how important it is that everybody has access to these drugs.
Switching gears to the patient implications, how would you paraphrase the implications of your work and the work of others in this field in terms of actual patient outcomes now and in the next 5 years?
So I think we are in an incredibly exciting time for patients. And what I would tell patients is, just wait, things are getting better really just about daily. But what I would also say to patients is to say, stop and think for just a little bit about how far we've come in such a short period of time. When I was in training, and actually even when I first got out of training not so long ago, we're talking about 25 years or so ago, the standard of care at that time was to actually laser the fovea to destroy the neovascular membrane. So imagine that we would sit there with a patient and say, today you're 20/80, I'm going to make you legally blind at 2200, and I'm going to give you a blind spot in the middle for the rest of your life, and 2 years from now you'll thank me because that blind spot is going to be smaller than if I left you alone. I mean, that's what we were doing, and imagine how far we've come in that short period of time in terms of what we can do for our patients, and I see that every single day. And with all the things that we've talked about today, I think there's tremendous hope for patients that we'll be able to do even better, and I don't doubt it at all. In fact, I think in the next few years, you said 5 years, but even shorter than that, I think we'll see a host of new things that will be on board. Now, not all of them may be in market, but we'll certainly see the data from clinical trials that will make us, they'll put us in a position to allow us to treat patients with far, far better outcomes, not only for the short term in terms of providing better efficacy, but in the long term in terms of maintaining their vision, combating fibrosis and atrophy, but hopefully also providing them with a sustainable treatment strategy. And when I say that, I think it's incumbent upon us to not just look at patients in the U.S. or look at patients in countries where there's a significant wealth or resources, but I think it's also important for us to think about and talk about and be bound to be able to help patients in resource-challenged countries as well.
Dr. Dugel, are there anything else that you'd like to share with us in terms of future perspectives?
Well, addressed to patients, as I say, I think I think this is a fantastic time. If you're ever going to get this horrible disease, because there are so many wonderful companies that are targeting so many interesting pathways. And again, I have no doubt that we'll do a lot better job than we're doing within the next few years.
Dr. Dugel, thank you so much.